Hello, it's Friday and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is day 9 on the penultimate day of the Patrick Frazee criminal trial. It's quite amazing that given the amount of evidence, given the amount of witnesses, given the scale of this case, it's sort of all boiled down to basically 9 days. Friday is essentially the 10th and final day. It seems on the same day that we'll have possibly a single witness testifying on behalf of Frazee. It's possible that he may testify. I think very unlikely. I think if he was going to testify, you'd probably have at least 2 days, similar to Kenny's testimony. You'd have 1 day for testimony in chief and 1 day for or more for cross-examination. I don't think that's going to happen. It looks like we will have someone vouching for him, someone possibly like his mother. It's difficult to say who it would be if it isn't his mother. But in this episode we're going to touch on basically 3 areas, namely the look, the hazmat suit, and the cover-up. And we'll go through that sort of via some of the tweets and some of the news coverage. We're also going to cover 2 intertextualities, quite interesting. And then I'm going to just touch on a little sort of personal fragment, something happening in my garden that's I think worth pondering as we go off into the weekend. But before we get to that, I first want to thank the 6,000 subscribers, the 1,000 that have joined True Crime Rocket Science since the last 5,000. This channel has been up and running about 2 months. I hope I don't sound arrogant, but I sort of I thought there would be a lot more interest in this channel. I'm not sure how long it does take to sort of set up a decent sized channel, but I am grateful for the 6,000 subscribers. Welcome to all of you, and I'm sure if you enjoy analysis, if you enjoy sort of quite a detailed examination of evidence, if you enjoy talking about true crime but kind of in a more informed, intelligent way, then you'll probably enjoy this channel. If you someone who really enjoys it, then this channel will also direct you from time to time to books on this case, and I am currently working on a book on the Frazee trial, which should be available certainly before the end of the year, possibly even before the end of this month, depending on how things pan out. So the idea is that this channel serves as a sort of promotional tool in some ways, but also as a sort of a side arm to the books and the blog. So if you're not aware of those, go and have a look. Go to crimerocket.com, join our Facebook group, follow me on Twitter, and yeah, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, like, share, ring the bell, leave a comment. You're welcome to share your thoughts, and let's get started. Okay, so Thursday the 14th of November, trial day 9, dawned as just another clear, sunny, blue sky day in Cripple Creek, Colorado. The day itself was another sort of somewhat underwhelming day compared to the momentum and just the sort of very compelling evidence that was generated in the first 6 or 7 days. In day 8 and 9, the sort of pace and the sort of type of testimony just seemed to sort of lose steam, lose a bit of momentum. which is a little bit unfortunate. When a prosecution feels a case that they really want to build momentum and then maintain momentum, and it's almost like, I know it sounds as though it's not true, but in a court case, in a trial, you especially a criminal trial, you really have a battle of narratives. You've got the narrative of the prosecution and you've got the narrative of the defense, and somebody's got to decide which narrative they're going to go with, which narrative they believe, which narrative sort of resonates with them. It's not quite as simple as just telling a good story, although that is a big part of it. It's also anchoring a story in evidence. It's not just telling a story, but a story that is demonstrably true. But the trick is to tell a story, especially if you're telling a long story, and engaging your audience and keeping their attention from start through the middle to the finish. And I thought the prosecution did very well from the beginning and through the middle, but this last section they have tipped over slightly. Just that momentum has just slipped a little bit. We don't know what's going to happen on day 9. They might end off with a sort of a flourish, but day 8 and 9 were definitely somewhat underwhelming. Having said that, it was still an interesting day with certain colourful aspects and certain certainly interesting aspects, and as I say, intertextualities. One thing that really caught my eye, and sort of really brings to life the dynamics going on inside the courtroom. Bear in mind, we can't see inside the courtroom. We can't really even see like the people entering and exiting the court. So there's kind of a second-hand reality to this. We get reports very third-hand and very diluted, and in kind of a way that we're not used to. We sort of used to having quite fluid access to criminal trials, especially high-profile, and in this case, there's sort of like a barrier. And although the journalists get in, we're still getting information via their filters, and so every now and then a journalist does provide a sort of a reality check, a kind of a vivid glimpse into some of the things that they notice. Some things that they may notice every day, we simply don't know. We don't know what the little habits and motions and sort of interactions are between the people in the court. Who looks at who, how people dressed, what are the little mannerisms, all that kind of thing. We simply don't know. And so every now and then you do get a little glimpse. One of them is a great tweet by Carol McKinley referring to Kelsey's father standing up during a break and looking at Patrick Frazee for a long time. And she obviously picked up on this and then glanced to Frazee and noticed that he didn't return her gaze, and that's something that one's got to bear in mind as well. Is we may be watching this, but you've got someone's father who is sitting there as well, and we might sit here where we are and sort of wonder about whether Frazee will be found guilty or innocent. The jury may be pondering it as well. Well, of course they are, but bear in mind, for them, they're looking at a fairly young man and they're thinking, well, we've got his fate in our hands. If even if they feel he's guilty in some way, it's the responsibility is on them to deprive him of his freedom, possibly for the rest of his life. That's quite a responsibility. And so everyone is seeing things from their own sort of perspectives, and one of them is certainly from Kelsey's father. And bear in mind, he's sitting there, he's finding out a lot of the evidence as we are, and he's getting a sense of discomfort about what he thinks may have happened to his daughter, and it's bringing out an emotional response, and and it's quite understandable. Anyway, we will come back to that tweet later. Let's just move on to the rest of the court day. Some of the news headlines, for example, from the Denver Channel, summarized it as CBI agent says he doesn't know where the investigation would be without Kenny's testimony. That's quite a interesting admission, and in a way quite a it's kind of a admission and an acknowledgement that the limits of law enforcement, the limits where, you know, there's a case happens, it can be high profile, and, you know, it can be somewhat unambiguous in the sense that someone has disappeared, where are they? And then you kind of have law enforcement stymied, you know, and stumped. They simply don't know where to begin, they don't know what to do, they don't know where to start. And so in this particular case, there's this suggestion that you know, if Kenny hadn't come forward, you know, what would actually have happened here? And I'm sure Frazee is thinking that himself. I'm sure he's thinking, if, you know, if she hadn't come forward, where would he be now, kind of thing. And surely he never anticipated this, and probably she never did either. Anyway, moving on. Sorry, just one more point to make with that. What it also shows here are the limits to law enforcement. It shows that you know, with a premeditated crime, which is what this looks like, even with a lot of resources, cadaver dogs, forensic people, detectives, you can just not have enough pieces of to put the puzzle together, and that's really the question that this court has got to address: is, are there enough pieces of the puzzle? And we'll deal with that in a second. Does it matter if you don't have direct evidence? Is a circumstantial case strong enough? And that brings us to the forensics. Headline from KOAA News: Forensics experts say blood evidence from townhome overwhelmingly matches Bereth. Now, what that headline also sort of implies is that you know, there's evidence of Kelsey in her own home. Well, yes, there should be. The question is there evidence of anyone else? Now, we've got testimony from Kenny saying that she was in the townhome, but how do we know for sure? You know, she was cleaning up Frazee's handiwork, allegedly, but there's no evidence of her doing that, and there's no evidence of him doing that. And that's really the debacle that the prosecution are sitting with. The next headline from the Denver Post is: Kelsey Bereth murder case, DNA testing on key pieces of evidence provides mixed results. And the testimony from a DA analyst dominated court proceedings. And this is really the gist of trial day 9, mixed results, neither here nor there. And it's an unfortunate aspect, you know, of the prosecution's case. It definitely is a weakness to the case. But having said that, there's definitely a lot of circumstantial evidence that holds up, that connects very well to itself. DNA evidence is often seen in modern true crime as the smoking gun. It can be. You can certainly have a DNA sample that absolutely puts someone at a scene. But it's not necessarily. It doesn't mean if you don't have DNA evidence that you don't have a smoking gun. It doesn't mean that if you don't have DNA evidence you don't have a case. That's kind of a misperception. But the fact is, the DNA evidence is weak. And why is it weak? Well, because Kelsey is gone. Because her remains have been it seems, allegedly destroyed, moved, transported, and destroyed. The crime scene, infiltrated by someone, cleaned extensively, possibly even by two people, the perpetrator and someone else. And so what that shows is that a crime scene can be completely compromised with a couple of hours effort. And this is the sort of aspect that I think is missing from a lot of true crime conversations, is you sort of have the prosecution side, which sort of says this happened, and then you have the defense side, which says, well, there's no DNA, it didn't happen. But then there's the middle ground, which is something happens and evidence is left behind, and then someone comes along and they clean up the evidence, and then there's very tiny sort of residual artifacts remaining. They're tiny little singular little pieces of evidence that are found. And then the question is, isn't that to be expected? In a crime scene that's been sort of gone over, cleaned up, covered up, isn't it to be expected that you're going to find tiny, tiny little pieces of evidence that did slip through? And then invariably what happens is the defense will say, these pieces of evidence are so tiny that this doesn't amount to anything. And while that's true, in a situation where you're acknowledging that there's a big cleanup, the things that are found do achieve or should achieve a singular kind of significance. And we'll deal with that kind of intertextuality in a moment. Let's just go on a bit further through the tweets. Ashley Franco summed it up pretty nicely, saying, "Nothing too crazy happening so far today. We've heard a lot of reiteration of things heard before, and this was especially true of the texts and so on, which we'll get to. But yes, it was definitely, I think, an underwhelming day for a lot of people listening in. As I said, it was a day where the prosecution's case faltered somewhat." From Elise Schmelzer, she refers to them finding Kelsey's blood on the condo couch, the baby gate, which was given by the elderly neighbor, on the toilet or the bottom of the toilet, in cracks of the floorboards and other places. This is another aspect that I'm not sure if the prosecution always addresses in a way that makes it abundantly obvious, abundantly explicable to a jury. And what I mean is, when you find traces of blood, but all the traces are sort of in cracks, underneath the toilet bowl, hidden behind this, hidden behind that, then if you don't explain it, you may have the perception that these are old traces that just have been there all along. And one should say that the fact that you're finding them between cracks and so on corresponds to the notion of a cleanup operation, right? It's what you would expect if there was a cleanup operation. In any event, Elise Schmelzer points out that overall there was very little DNA found inside the condo. And again, that should say, how come people lived here? Where's all the DNA? And, kind of something that the prosecutors could have done in this case. This is just a suggestion. This is a true crime rocket science hypothesis, and maybe there's dubious value in the field, but the suggestion would be, do a DNA analysis of some of the condos next door. And what I simply mean is, especially one with the same amount of occupants, a mother and child, for example, and you do a DNA of one or two or three of the apartments, simply to see, well, what is the average sort of amount of DNA that would sort of be left behind. And I'm not saying that this is absolute evidence, it's not absolutely compelling evidence. It's the kind of it should have the kind of weight as a lie detector test um, or handwriting analysis. In other words, it's useful, but it's not absolutely, I'm going to, take things one way or another. Simply just helpful. And so you could then base the averages of that and then compare it to, how much DNA is found at the crime scene. And if the amount is far, far less, then you could say, well, the normal percentage is X and this is X minus that, question mark, right? So that's just a suggestion. According to Schmelzer, the biggest blow to prosecutors was that the haystack did not test positive for human fluid. So, and that is a huge blow. What that shows is, the whatever those fluids were, it's not even testing positive for DNA or even human traces of any kind, and that then calls that evidence into doubt. And so what's sort of interesting is you sort of have the narrative of a crime happening at the condo and then a transfer to the haystack on the Nash Ranch, and then a transfer with Kenny's assistance, with her support, to the Frazee Ranch, according to her. And so you kind of have basically three different crime scenes. You actually have at least four if you consider Kenny burning Kelsey's phone in her back garden, and there arguably even more. But let's say there are four crime scenes. Then this one at the haystack can't be anchored in absolute evidence, and so that one then starts to fizzle. But you've still got two or three other crime scenes to work with, and I think that should be borne in mind in terms of the mosaic. If we go to just a snippet from the Denver Channel, it refers to Frazee being excluded from many of the tests. So Frazee's DNA is not found at the crime scene. And according to him, he made the transfer. He picked up his daughter outside in the alley, which in itself is interesting. It's interesting that in his version he never went into the condo, and you would expect him to go inside, and I think surveillance footage seems to show him going inside. But in any event, there's not much of him inside. But then there were two samples found on the floorboard, and again you've got to say, if the crime scene was cleaned up, then aren't these two samples really significant? And not just that, they found on the floorboard. So somehow they withstood possible cleanup. And so what were they doing on the floorboard? How did they get there? And one possibility is that they mixed with Kelsey's blood when it drained down there. That's one possibility. And then we go on to a tweet by Jacob Rogers from the Gazette. He refers to a DNA analyst testifying that no blood was found on the 3 wooden bats at Frazee's home. It's another aspect of this case that's somewhat weak from the perspective of the prosecution. The murder weapon has never been found. I'm not sure whether Kenny has said anything about that. I don't know whether she said anything about what happened to it. But one suspects that it may have burnt in the fire. But if it was an aluminum bat, then I don't know. Then there might be another possibility. I think another question is, what bats did Frazee have in his possession prior? People who were in his home before the time may have known that. And if something has been missing, then subsequently, then that might point one way or another. In any event, we don't have the murder weapon, and the bats that were found were negative. And so this is where the defense came forward, and they generated a little bit of momentum, and they managed to sow a couple of seeds of reasonable doubt. Adam Steigerwald focused on the fact that there was no human blood or even human DNA found on the haystack in the Red Barn, where Frazee is accused of stashing Kelsey's body temporarily. This is also from a tweet by Jacob Rogers. Although that's a strong case, that's sort of just one area. So even if you could sort of snip out the Red Barn from the whole story, I don't know if that would be enough. I mean, that's a nice victory for the defense, but it's one thing that you can snip out. What about the rest? Another aspect that I think one's got to ask is, if Kelsey's body was on this haystack, how does one explain that fluid? Let's say the fluid was blood. How does one explain that it doesn't test positive? I think there are a couple of possibilities. One is the length of time that passed. Another is it's not a sort of secure scene, so you may have had a situation of insects and small predators and small critters sort of arriving in the area. There may have been a certain amount of decomposition, and who knows, it may even have been treated by Frazee himself. He may have thrown petrol or oil over that spot itself. We know he went to a lot of effort to, well, not we know, we suspect that he went to a lot of effort to cover up certain things like the burn patch. He didn't just burn, it's not just an allegation that he burnt the body, but also that he covered up the burn site. So if you take that analogy to the haystack, couldn't he have gone back and also treated that, right, in some way? And that brings us to another tweet by Jacob Rogers, referring to Frazee's attorney starting the day by honing in on many items found inside Kelsey's townhouse that didn't test positive for blood, including the candles and a floor vent. So there's also the defense saying, well, there's not really any traces of my client in the condo. Maybe something happened to her, but it didn't necessarily have anything to do with Frazee. And then what that then suggests is that, well, couldn't it have been Kenny? I mean, if Kenny was at the crime scene and she'd considered killing Kelsey before, then didn't she do it in the end? I hope Jacob Rogers will forgive me for homing in on just a grammatical issue, just something that he said in his tweet. And the reason I'm doing it is it's something that I've had to deal with as a true crime writer myself. Is it homing in on, or is it honing in? And I'm doing this to help out readers and just those interested, because it was something that I needed to get certainty on. The dictionary definition of home in is, finding or moving directly towards something. Finding your way to destination, like homing pigeons or homing missiles or whatever. You can also home in on the answer, right? It's one of those weird words. When you think about it, it just sounds weird. I mean, think about home in on the answer. But that is how we speak. Hone in is also acceptable. So if you see hone in, it's not wrong. But it's less common, and it's kind of comes from a different meaning. It comes from sharpening or making something more acute. So hone-in isn't wrong, but if you say home, sorry, if they're the words in on, then it should really be home in on something, right? Okay, and then on the morning break, Sam Kramer provided a couple of highlights referring to Adam Stegerwald, emphasizing the fact that Frazee's DNA is barely inside Kelsey's town home. Just basically providing some doubt there, just saying, whatever the prosecution says, you can't really place my client at the scene. There's no direct, or there's very little direct evidence of him being there. While that's true, the surveillance video is kind of different. The surveillance video is certainly pointing to him being there at a very critical juncture. We also know from the cell phone narrative, which we'll get to in a second, that things take a turn after that. And so the timeline is I think where Frazee finds himself in a pickle, and we'll deal with that also in a moment. Another tweet by Sam Kramer refers to the prosecutor asking Caitlin Rogers, I think from the CBI, if she was surprised at the absence of Kenny's DNA. So you have a situation of in a way two perpetrators, and there's very little evidence of Frazee, and then there's absolutely none of Kenny. And we know for a fact that Kenny went to the condo to give Kelsey coffee. So we know for a fact that Kenny says she was there, Kelsey says she was there, and I think a colleague also said that she'd said she was there with the coffee. And so there's one instance, and yet Kenny's DNA is not there. If we accept that she did clean up the crime scene, again, the defense would dispute that and say, well, she says that. It's actually quite an interesting question if the defense would dispute that. They might not dispute that because perhaps they want Kenny to be at the crime scene. So you've got a weird selective dismissal of evidence in theory here. But the part that I want to emphasize is Caitlin Rogers said she wasn't surprised that there was no DNA left because Kenny was wearing protective clothing and using bleach. Now, sometimes when we deal with true crime, we sort of come after the fact, we come to the evidence, and we sort of very much inclined to be what you see is what you get. If you don't get traces, then basically the pendulum swings the other way. But what we see here is that it is possible or it looks like it is possible to enter a crime scene, work hard, get down on your hands and knees for 3 to 4 hours, and to be busily at work and not only clean up a crime scene to virtual completion, not only removing traces potentially of a particular party, but also not leaving your own traces behind. That is one of the risks of cleaning up a crime scene, is that in the process of cleaning up you are going to leave behind traces. And anyway, what this shows is that using a protective clothing, just something as simple as that, and then using bleach, a simple thing like that can be effective. And then that brings us to the hazmat suit. For me, this is it's a crazy to visualize. It's crazy to sort of visualize this person, wandering almost like in a spacesuit, almost like a crime scene investigator, except not there to find evidence for collection, but to find evidence for concealment and to get rid of. And I think true crime aficionados, as Scott Reich refers to you, it's important, I think, to bear this visual in mind. This sort of almost circus-like figure of someone in a hazmat suit, but who's not part of law enforcement, running through a crime scene and going through it almost like with a fine-tooth comb, picking up evidence and sloshing through the pink blood and translucent blood, and then sort of ending up cleaning it effectively, getting rid of most of it. And if anyone would be used to that and effective at doing that, it would be a nurse. And so this brings us to a couple of intertextualities. I'm not really going to reference them in too much detail, but one of the things I've noticed in covering a lot of high-profile cases is there's this strange intrusion in the middle of a crime scene of doing the laundry, of cleaning chemicals, of somebody hanging up the washing. In the middle of a murder narrative, there's somebody taking time out to do the laundry. There are smells of bleach in the Chris Watts case. There's smells of bleach in the Amanda Knox case. Sudden need to do laundry and mopping up on the morning of the murder. Laundry hanging from the rack in the hallway. And this is from someone who her roommates argued against. That she didn't seem to want to do laundry. In the Madeleine McCann case, you have the mother washing Madeleine's shirt on the day that she disappeared. In the Jodi Arias case, there's also laundry. In fact, Jodi Arias disposes of the camera she had with her in the laundry. Not a very good idea, because they recovered the images, the metadata on the camera chip. O.J. Simpson did his laundry on the night Nicole was murdered. And not to take things too far, but in Casey Anthony's case, Kaylee was actually sort of disposed of in a laundry bag. There are also a lot of interesting sort of artifacts in the John Benet Ramsey case to do with laundry and clothing lying around. But it's in the Amanda Knox case in particular that I think this is very analogous and very relevant, which is, as I said, it's this idea of stepping inside a crime scene and then stepping out and then leaving behind sort of nothing. You sort of get rid of evidence, and in the process of doing that, you don't leave any evidence behind. And someone actually kind of made a joke about the Amanda Knox case, saying that it's just not possible to go through a crime scene like with a microscope and get rid of evidence. Well, it is possible. You're not going through it with a microscope and tweezers. You are going through it with bleach and simply covering up your limbs. And in the Henry van Breda case, his defense was that two armed intruders entered the house, but they were covered from head to toe in so they had balaclavas on their heads and they had gloves on their hands, and that's why they didn't leave any evidence behind. And so that's also trying to put the space-suited person onto some sort of intruder. It's the same sort of idea. The point is, it is possible to enter and exit a crime scene without leaving DNA. You simply cover all aspects of the body, and then you use bleach. By the way, bleach also features strongly in the Stephen Avery case. Happy with that. And now we move on to another aspect on the testimony and of Trial Day 9, which dealt with the texts. Again, none of this was particularly new. None of this was shocking. A lot of it was just a reiteration of what we knew already, what a lot of people had seen before in I think warrants, but also and maybe in the media. But bear in mind, the jury might not necessarily have seen them. So that was what the point was in going through it. They focused especially on the text on the days before and after Thanksgiving, when Frazee allegedly killed Kelsey. Now, Sam Kramer tweeted that, the the texts have been seen before in warrants, and also pointed out, he pointed out that the defense noted that Frazee didn't seem mad at Kelsey because there were texts late in the evening on November the 21st and 22nd. Bear in mind that was when Kelsey went to fetch him medication because he had apparently thrown up. What the defense seems to be saying here is, going up to the moment of the crime, Frazee seems to be a nice guy. He seems to be not angry or emotional in any way towards Kelsey. But what's a bit strange about that is, although he's a nice guy here, he's not such a nice guy in other sort of areas. He's sort of, when his child is born, he gets angry. When a dog is not obeying him, he, according to some people, pummels the dog. He's the one time that he's on an even keel is right before the crime happens, which seems a little too good to be true, doesn't it? And I really like the way Jacob Rogers describes this whole cloud of text sent between Kelsey and Patrick after her disappearance. I like the way he describes it as part of a ruse orchestrated by Frazee. I agree with that 100%. The prosecution claimed that he composed the text himself, or that he had his mistress write them to lead investigators off track. It does seem that some of the texts were sent by his mistress to his boss from Idaho, but in any event, the point is this idea of a ruse, of an orchestration, and possibly of it being done by more than one person. And that brings us to another intertextuality. And so we know in the Chris Watts case that Watts staged a couple of texts and also made missed calls to Shanann. We know he did that. The same happened with Scott Peterson, who staged his calls to Lacey on his way back from the marina in San Francisco Bay. He left voicemail messages. All of that was part of the staging. And so in the same way, when you have a person in a spacesuit wandering around a crime scene concealing evidence, you also have the puppet master staging things, putting things there that provide the appearance of something else. And that seems to be the way true crime is going. There's sort of a more and more elaborate charades, orchestrations going on, and one's got to be in tune to these possibilities in order to intuit them and to see them. If we go a little bit further back in time through the true crime archives, you have something similar to that. For example, in the Jodi Arias case, she was doing the same thing, but in terms of her diary. She wrote, she sort of made bogus entries in her diary, basically anticipating that her diary would be read, and it was read in court, and so she was effectively lying to her diary and trying to mislead. It goes even further than that. When Jodi Arias left the crime scene, she called Travis and left an answer on his phone, trying to sound upbeat, trying to sound nonchalant, and the whole point of that was plausible deniability. The general thrust of messages between Kelsey and Patrick, according to Jacob Rogers, it often revolved around when either would pick up their daughter and how Kelsey's Black Friday shopping went. Clearly staged message, or a clear candidate for a staged message was on the night of November 23rd, when Kelsey asked Frazee supposedly if he'd keep caring for their daughter overnight. November 25th was the last time the two texted, and then there was also the question, again probably a staged question, whether Kelsey was sort of asking Frazee if he really loved her, and he answered, "Of course I love you." And the question is, is that true? Given what we know and given what we think we know, is it true? Is it "of course I loved you," or is it "of course something else"? And the interesting thing is, if we take his own words, in the narrow confines of his cell phone, and we relate it to what he was saying to other people, you have a mismatch there, and that's difficult to explain. Last night I was putting together some research, and there's some very interesting information regarding Kelsey's boss, what he said about the text that he received, and then also from the social worker, their interpretation of the same fabric. So yeah, I'm not going to go into Mary Longmire's testimony here. If you're interested, you can go to the Denver Channel's coverage of Trial Day 9. Longmire was a Taylor County Department of Human Services employee, and she spoke about her conversation with Frazee and him talking about their contact before and after Kelsey disappeared. I'm not going to deal with it here, but I do deal with it in some detail in the book that I'm busy with, Murder Most Foul. It's very interesting, the statement analysis that one can do, and one of the interesting standout words for me is the way that Frazee refers to their conversation as heated. Using that particular word to me is very significant. And so that's about it. There was also a tweet from Jennifer Molson saying that she, in her opinion, the Frazee trial is nearing its end, and she was pondering whether we would know his fate by the end of the week. I don't think we will know his fate. We won't know what the jury decides, but I think we will have quite a good idea from the closing arguments what things are looking like. It will be interesting to hear the defense's closing arguments in particular, but one of the journalists was asked for his opinion on what he thought of the verdict. Journalists can't really be drawn into those sort of discussions. They've got to stay objective. True crime writers, on the other hand, can I think share their feelings about the case. I think if you speculate and you've been covering something on a daily basis and you're very informed, then I think it carries some weight. I think if you don't know much about a case, I think it's better not to speculate. At this stage, I do think the prosecution have put on a stronger case. Certainly they have put on a case. The defense have done very little. I don't think the defense are justified in putting up nothing, but the problem is they are hamstrung with what they could put up if they did. That's their difficulty. The defense have in their corner the fact that there's very little forensic evidence. That's certainly in their corner, but what they have against them is an enormous mosaic of of circumstantial evidence, and while it's true that quite a few pieces of the mosaic are missing, on the periphery, the question is that mosaic large enough to paint sort of a picture of what likely happened, and is that portrait clear and compelling? And I would argue that it is. Okay, I see we had 50 minutes in this episode, so let's wrap up with the tweet of the day. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to touch on another tweet by Carol McKinley, also from day 9. She refers, it's just a very colorful description, and once again it just paints a little picture of what none of us can see, and what the reporters that are present do see. And so McKinley writes of trial day 9 of the defense attorney Adam Steigerwald wearing a nice suit, bright orange socks, and then him standing there and questioning why no DNA was found on the hay where the prosecution say Kelsey's body was found. So just this image of the defense attorney kind of in a pinstripe suit and bright orange socks is sort of trying to poke holes, and there are a couple of holes. He also then questions why none of Crystal Kenny's DNA was in the condo, and then the prosecution answers that she wore a hazmat suit, which is kind of funny. I'm kind of surprised why the defense would talk about Crystal's DNA not being in the condo. I think it would strengthen her case if she was there. On the other hand, they could shrug their shoulders in a general sense and say this crime could have been committed by anyone, but again, one would come back to the surveillance footage and say, well, why doesn't anyone else appear in them? And so the tweet of the day for trial day 9 goes to Carol McKinley for this touching tweet about Kelsey's father, Daryl Bereth, standing up, looking at Patrick Frazee for a long time. And then Frazee, who was talking to the public defender, I guess investigator, didn't return his gaze, but it does seem like Frazee knew that Kelsey's father was looking at him, because it looks as though when Daryl looked away, then Frazee looked at him. And McKinley goes on to say that everyone seems tired, referring to the family members, referring to the lawyers most likely, referring to perhaps the judge, referring to possibly the reporters as well. And then she wraps it up by saying closings could happen tomorrow, and that is likely what we will see today on trial day 9 on Friday. If you think about it, it's a very, very short presentation, just 10 trial days, of which a couple ended early and a couple started late. So, it's summing up a extensive investigation, a lot of evidence, a lot of witnesses in just 10 short days. And in a weird way, those 10 days sort of are even shorter than the time that Kelsey was missing before she was reported missing. She disappeared on November 22nd. She was only reported missing on December 2nd. So the trial went on shorter than the time that it took to notice Kelsey was missing by her mother, which I'm just mentioning as kind of an irony. And so two final things I want to sort of just touch on are the dynamics that one witnesses in court. I've sat in on a couple of trials, and it's invaluable for a reporter or for a writer, especially for a true crime writer. You notice a lot of subtleties, you notice a lot of emotions, notice a lot of little dynamics. You get to study the accused, as we say in South Africa, the defendant in America in person. You notice how they look around, you notice their demeanor, you notice just the vibe that they give off and the impression that they're giving off. And yeah, it's important to see how they look at the people around them and interact with the people around them. In the Oscar Pistorius case, one of the people I sat next to during the trial has subsequently been assassinated. He was like literally a hit was put on him, so that kind of thing is quite shocking to think of in retrospect. He was the guy I sat next to in the trial was reported on in the media at the time. His brother even sort of made a remark about him being in trial. Another case that I sat in on, Henry van Breda, there were a couple of times when he actually looked at me. There was one occasion where he actually brushed by me and said something to me, which was pretty unnerving. But yeah, it is always interesting seeing how the cameramen, which are not allowed in this particular case, but in that case, how the cameraman would go right up to him and, get their photo of the day, push the lens right up into his face, and he was quite used to it at the time and kind of played along, and just seeing those interactions firsthand were really interesting. And I also brought my camera into court, and on I think 3 occasions I took photos of him, once with a very long lens, and on those occasions he actually glanced at me, and one occasion he really stared at me with looked like malice, and I snapped a photo of that moment, and that became the cover of my book Diablo. And a final thing I just want to mention about just being in court. I was in court with the Jason Roeder trial, and I actually happened to be sitting in an area where the where Jason Roeder was himself supposed to sit, and so he also approached me and made kind of a charming remark that I wouldn't sit there if I were you. And so you can actually be in court and actually have personal interactions with these people, and you tend to think of them as monsters and as alien human beings, but when you're actually in court and they talk to you, it's very troubling. Sometimes it's troubling because of they reinforce a sense that they are chilling in some way, but in another way they can be troubling in that they're quite likable. And I touch on this aspect in a video I've just posted up, debunking myths about Chris Watts. Just that we do need to humanize the people in true crime. We tend to demonize them, and that's why we don't understand these cases. We need to remember that they're people, even though they may not be very nice people. And the people attending the trial are also people. They're people that get tired. They're people that get worn down by this kind of barrage of negative testimony, with significant implications. If you're found guilty, you lose your life as well. And if someone has killed someone else, 2 lives are effectively lost. The victim and then the perpetrator who's caught and then loses his life. Interestingly, with the Frazee trial, Cheryl testified and then she left. I know with the Oscar Pistorius trial, the victim's mother, you could see the trial all over her face. It's difficult attending these trials. It's difficult. It's kind of like a reality check, but day after day after day. And for some people, it can be difficult dealing with reality, in such a it can be quite intimidating. So it's interesting that even though Cheryl testified, Kelsey's father remained in attendance, and we can see, through this look that he gave Frazee, how he's feeling about it. Okay, so we're at the hour mark. I'm ready to wrap up trial day 9. I will see you guys on trial day 10. That wrap up may come sometime over the weekend. I want to wish you guys a good weekend, and I want to leave you with a final thought, and it's to do with something that's happening in my garden. We're in summer here in South Africa, and there's a bird known as a Cape Robin chat that has made its home in my garden, and I put quite a lot of effort into the garden, and it's gratifying to see this little bird appreciating there's quite a lot of life in the garden, bugs, little lizards and worms and so on, and this bird, which is an insectivore, hops around the ground quite a lot, has decided this is a good place to make a home. And lately I've heard a little baby sort of making a noise whenever it gets fed, and the baby seems to have left the nest and is now floating around various parts of the garden as it's trying to find its feet and trying to get itself out on the wing. And so seeing this little baby bird in the garden trying to assert itself on this world, at the moment living in this little box, which is a fragment of the world. It's this tiny green fragment, but which is ultimately connected to the suburbs where I am, and then the fabric of the rest of the country and the world. And for now, its world is this tiny little, place. And what this reminds us of, I think, is in the context of true crime and of this murder case, and where Kelsey's child continues to grow and come into her own. Her mother's disappeared, but I think what this reminds us of is just how fragile life is, and how beautiful life is, and how precious life is. And one thing that I would just wish for you to take away is, we can listen to the evidence, we can care about what happened to Kelsey, but let's remember to go out over the weekend and live our lives, and to smell the flowers, feel the sunshine, radiate confidence, and enjoy the gift that we have. Juxtaposing the terrible things that have happened to some other people that we know about, we still have our lives, and it's up to us to live them and to enjoy them and to make the most of our lives. Thank you for listening.